So Just Mercy should have been a movie that in some ways tore your heart apart, because you want to, I want to think that that should never be a definition of who we are as human beings, as a community. And yet there we have the evidence in front of us. And so when we ask the question, where is God in the movie? It's, you know, it's tough because all of that seems to be not of what God calls. And yet here's this fierce frontline person being that. Where did you see God in the movie?
Well, he
Where
could
did
have
that?
been, he could have been any, up in the northern climates, and he could have been a very rich lawyer,
Yeah,
but his heart was down there. His
Yeah.
heart was just meant to help.
and it's pretty remarkable to see a person like that, isn't it? Because there's a whole lot of where it's easier to follow the American dream, right? And I'm not really saying that in a negative way, but to find someone who chooses a different path is quite remarkable, isn't it?
It is.
What questions did it bring into your mind as you watched that movie?
Well, I think, I don't know if it's a question, but I think all of us have been many aspects of a lot of those people that either we've been silent or went along to go along.
Yeah, it definitely convicts you to say, why haven't I noticed this and why haven't I done something about it? One of the things that was truly remarkable to me was right at the end, for every 9 people executed in the US, 1 person has been wrongly convicted, proven innocent and released. And so we have a 10% fail rate on a death issue. 10% fail rate on that. It seems like, how can we allow that to be true? And the tough part for us as relatively advantaged people in our world is we can ignore it, because typically not my friends, my neighborhood, my whatever, right? And yet, isn't that where we really need to be present? Randy, how are you? Oh, he's still connecting.
Randy had some law training, didn't he?
Randy did have law training, so he's going to have to lead us through the intricacies of the death process, the death row process.
Piece of cake, Randy.
Randy, you're still muted.
So Earl,
Although haven't we all kind of dreamt of muting the lawyers in our lives?
I just had finished watching the movie. We just got it from Netflix this morning. I've spent the last 2 hours watching the movie, so no advanced preparation here.
Right, it's all right though. I think the hard part about all of these issues is there's a whole lot of, in the midst of what sometimes is a slow process, there feels like there's a whole bunch of not preparation, because there's I don't know why it is we have such a value on taking life. You know, the national program of capital punishment has restarted. I mean, we hadn't been doing any executions for a while at the national level, and now we're starting again. Why is that so important for us? Why is it that we feel that's worthwhile?
It's difficult to speak to that because where I am in Minnesota, we haven't had capital punishment since, I believe, 1911. And no bill proposing the renewal of capital punishment has ever advanced out of a committee. in the subsequent years.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear from the statistics that the states that have capital punishment have the highest rates of homicide.
Yeah.
The states that do not, do not.
Yeah.
The only legitimate goal of the criminal law, which is achieved by capital punishment, is specific deterrence. That is to say, the individual who is the subject of capital punishment will never commit another crime by definition.
Yeah.
But it has no general deterrent value. It's not rehabilitative.
Right.
And in fact, it probably can be argued that it legitimates the use, the taking of life, because society engages in it itself.
You know, I think of it this way. When you take your 4-year-old and say, don't hit your brother, and you're spanking him, and it's like, how does that, what does that say? Don't kill, and we're killing. You know, what is someone going to take, what is society going to take out of that action?
It is, you know, inexplicable to me, because as we can see, it's to be crass, it's not economically sensible. You know, keeping the, I don't know anymore what the average duration of a stay on death row is, but it's measured in decades, not in years. And
Well, they showed the one prisoner who was played by 50 Cent. I can't remember his name, but I mean the character's name. That he'd, from the time that was taking place, it was like 20 years later that he was released. 20 years. At what cost, like you say?
In the state of Minnesota, it costs, well, when I got out of the law, it was about $40,000 a year per inmate just to incarcerate someone. It's probably more expensive on death row because of the additional security and other requirements. Laying aside the cost of the time and effort involved in handling innumerable post-trial proceedings, motions for retrial, appeals of denials of motions for retrial,
Right.
federal habeas corpus petitions, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It just plain doesn't make any sense.
Well, unless we're looking at it from an economic sense. Oh, look, I'm making lots of money off of this. Look at how much money I am prosecuting these, you know, and that's not where I want to go. You know, our justice system should not be a profit center.
Well, and unfortunately, as I say, I don't see the trend being reversed, because the most recent suspension of capital punishment was based on it being applied in an arbitrary fashion, and that's been, now the bases of that decision have been eroded away.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion that capital punishment is of its nature cruel and unusual punishment will not fly with the current Supreme Court, especially with the addition of Justice Amy Coney Barrett,
Yeah.
because capital punishment was fully recognized by the guys that drafted the United States Constitution as a legitimate exercise of governmental power. So,
You know, I think there's two fundamental reasons why I struggle with anything like this. First of all, what he said near the end, as he's testifying to the U.S. Senate, right? In that scene, he said something like this: "I've learned that each of us is more than the worst we've done." And I think as soon as this happens, And not just capital, not just capital murder, capital crimes, but anytime we do a crime, in some people's minds, you become only that crime, right? And that really cheapens humanity to me. And so, I mean, we have to be better than just seeing that one act as being the act that defines you. And yet I'm not certain that we're doing that. Second of all, what I learned long ago as a first grade teacher is that punishment never changes behavior. It only stops behavior. And what are we adding to the punishment? I'm not saying punishment is wrong. I'm saying that it doesn't change behavior. So what are we adding? What are we putting into our system that allows behavior to change? And at least part of what I think this movie was showing was the humanity that was there in those people on death row. I loved the interchange between the three guys in the adjoining cells, right? And the real relationships they had. And how do we help them step into those real relationships, not just whatever the one thing was?
Well, after 30 years and more criminal justice system, I can say that every effort to address the problem of crime that is reactive is doomed to failure.
Yeah. And Randy, how much of our system is reactive like that?
And entirely. Yeah. I'm here to tell you, I mean, as a prosecutor, you'd think I'd be interested in prisons, but prisons are the worst investment. I won't call it investment. It's the greatest waste of government money around. You might as well put it down the toilet or burn it up with a flamethrower, you know.
Especially, Randy, how much does it feel like prisons perpetuate and even augment crime rather than diminish it, as they are a breeding ground sometimes for what will happen in 5 years when people are released?
Of course, that's true. Of course, that's true. I'm not saying that people are not rehabilitated during a time spent incarcerated, but they are rehabilitated in spite of the fact they are incarcerated, not because of the fact they are incarcerated. It is the influence of institutions and individuals that function completely independent of the penal system that people will experience some change of character, you know, while they're incarcerated. It has nothing to do with, I mean, I would say to someone who was bent on retribution as a response to a terrible act, I'd say, don't you realize that putting someone in it's like a reverse society,
Mm-hmm.
which is what prison is.
Right.
The society where every value is stood on its head.
Yeah.
And people who functioned as sharks among prey fish when they were out in ordinary society are now captured in an environment where everyone is a shark.
Right.
You know, I can't imagine anything worse. You know, I wouldn't want to spend 30 seconds in prison. It's, you know, death would be, you know, a blessing by comparison. But that's maybe because of the attitude I have about death. But the money that is spent, and I have taken bicycle trips in Georgia, Louisiana. We went over the border into Mississippi, and the first thing we saw was a correctional institution.
Mhm.
These are desperately poor states.
Right.
And everywhere you go, there are these enormous correctional complexes.
Yeah.
I was literally served my meal in Louisiana by guys that were brought in from a correctional institution, uh, as well, what we used to call peonage, cheap labor
Mhm.
for the bike tour. I mean, it's just foolish. If that money was spent on schools, I mean, I can't guarantee anything, but I'd say in all my life, I can't tell you what the answer is, but education is the closest thing to the answer that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
And
I think what I hear you saying is there's a lot better investments for our federal funds and for any of our funds, any of our tax.
yes, proactive,
Right.
turn people. You don't beat people into being good citizens. You build good citizens. You
Yeah.
don't punish people into being good citizens.
The hard part, though, don't you think, is that we have a whole lot of Wild West still in us, where we think that punishment is what has to happen. We have a whole lot of I can beat him into, like as you say, and I just don't think that's ever worked, but we think it has.
I have many thoughts on that, but I mean, I think we're only just now as a society coming to terms with some of that. I think, unfortunately, we were built as a nation in the 19th century being able to deal with our problems of antisocial behavior by a variant of what the British did, transportation. They used to send their criminals to Australia or Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
We would send our criminals either directly or by force of societal pressure to the frontier.
Yeah.
And that's the mentality we have, the frontier. And of course, our dedication to individual liberty, and as an aspect of that liberty being the right to keep and bear arms, it's no wonder we have the largest, or certainly the largest of any of what I would call Western democracy portion of our population behind bars. We give people the greatest freedom to commit antisocial acts, and consequently, we have the greatest number of people that we deprive of that freedom because of their antisocial behavior.
And the hard part is many other things enter into it. One of the most interesting scenes was the first time that the lawyer, Brian, walked into the prison, and the guard says, "I'm going to have to search you." Part of that is the asserting of authority, right? I'm the guard, I get to. Part of it is the black-white issue. I'm a white man and you're not. And all these dynamics of power, of hierarchy enter into the prison things a lot. Have you seen the movie The 13th? No, it's just 13th. Have you seen that movie? It's about the 13th Amendment. It's an Ava DuVernay movie, and it traces the 13th Amendment is that which abolished slavery, and her basic thing is that we continue slavery in the prison system today, doing things like that, those work details that you were talking about earlier, Randy. But many of those things it's a set up societal system that keeps certain people in their place. That's a pretty brutal system to have as our way of ordering society, isn't it?
We've alluded in the past to disparities in educational funding.
Mm-hmm.
See, I regard that as the most grievous example of keeping people in their place.
Right.
You know, the denial of an equal opportunity, a real equal opportunity. I'm not saying everybody's going to end up equal, but everybody ought to, you know, start from the same start line
Mm-hmm.
and be given the tools to get as far down the road as they can get.
Yeah.
And that's where, like I say, the money we spend for places that essentially where we house our failures is better spent trying to create more successes.
Yeah, and the hard part about that is that it means that we have to care about our kids as much as I care about my kids. And I think that's difficult for everyone. Because I know I love my kid. I don't know all of our kids. And so it's harder for me to step away from the advocating for the closer relationship. And yet that's exactly what we have to do, isn't it? Go ahead, Nancy.
I think part of that's okay, it's just a phone. I think one of the issues is in our society, having control is important, whether it's as a teacher, when, you know, or crowd control. I think we are, and so we get those knee-jerk reactions because right now, like you said, I've got to stop that behavior. And sometimes stopping the behavior is a quick fix, and we don't take the time, don't have the time to change the behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of things going into it.
I remember vividly one of my learning moments as a first grade teacher. I'm there doing the stuff that happens, and I taught the lesson, and they're all at work, and a kid comes up and says what kids say to a teacher, I don't know, 50, 100 times a day. Can I go to the bathroom? Can I get a drink of water? Can I, you know? And I remember I said no, because I could. Not because I had any really good reason why they should or shouldn't. It's that I had power and I could say no. It wouldn't have hurt the kid to be able to go over and get a drink of water. Wouldn't have hurt the classroom at all. But I think that dynamic of power that you're talking about, Nancy, is a tough one for us to overcome. And many of the people who step into the system, the justice system, are people that have at least some drive for power.
Also, all 30 of your kids are going to line up to get a drink of water because they're tired of doing those worksheets.
That's right. We fear the worst. And I think that fearing of the worst in our justice system, especially if there's any hints of social strata or discrimination on racial issues, if we're looking and we're saying, I got to fear those folks, so I got to keep them in line, it's tough.
Jim, I think that at the end, when they were saying how many times that corrupt sheriff was reelected, that has just the point that you were making, just to keep them in line.
Yep. Yep. But think of Arizona. Joni and I lived for decades in Maricopa County. That's where she was born, right? And how many times did Joe Arpaio get elected there?
Right.
And Joe Arpaio was all about punishment and harshest possible view of the criminal. We perpetuate that type of thing. easily perpetuated. And I think part of the reason is because of fear. If I fear you, or if somebody has told me enough fear messages about whoever, you know, in Phoenix, it was South Phoenix. That's a scary place, right? That's, of course, the more racial area of the city. And it's a good area. But they easily teach themselves to fear that.
I think God came out in small pieces, like I think it always does, when people would change their mind or be willing to be witnesses, or willing to testify, even though they hadn't for years. Like the one guy that they came to his door, and he looks around to see if anybody, you know, sees him, and then invites Stevenson in. That he's, and I think we all can do those little things and be glad we did.
Mm-hmm. But it takes us having to see beyond. At one point, I think it was when they first presented their, they were presenting their case to the first judge, and he says something along the lines of, "It's easy to see this case as only one man trying to prove his innocence, but it's more than that. It's about our system. What is our system doing? And is our system giving this type of person, a person who looks like him, a fair shake?" And there's way too many stories of that come out in the Black community, for example, that says something like, well, they arrested me because I was Black like the guy they were looking for, even though the specifics of didn't match anything. So we take the easiest Black man rather than do the harder work. We vilified the group rather than try to deal with the individual case of. But Randy, how much pressure is there on prosecutors to get the case finished rather than truly find justice? Tell me about that.
Well,
I mean, I don't want to downplay your profession. I don't want to do that. I just,
it's you know, fortunately, as I said, in Minnesota we don't have capital punishment. I never was, you know, compelled to deal with. I dealt with homicides, but you know, I never had to confront, you know, a parent demanding, you know, the death penalty or something like that. But the element that really creates the pressure is race and the involvement of children, of course, but trying to achieve justice in a community that you know has a deep underlying racial bias is challenging.
yeah.
It's, you know, because my boss, the county attorney, he's an elected official. Fortunately, you know, there's no restraint. I don't believe there was a great deal of danger of voter suppression of Native Americans in Beltrami County, but my county, but certainly, you know, we would deal with, you know, rape, aspects of cases which would evoke, you know, a racial response from either the perpetrator's standpoint or the victim's standpoint. And that was probably the most difficult thing.
And I'm sure as the elected official, your boss, pleasing the majority population sure makes his reelection easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's the strangely, I mean, I understand that for purposes of a movie, you need to focus on something that has very dramatic value. And nothing could be more dramatic than capital punishment.
Right.
But I'm here to tell you that the greatest systemic injustice that I see in the criminal justice system is socioeconomic, not racial. When they talk about racial profiling, quite frequently I'd say, you're not dealing with a case of racial profiling, you're dealing with a case of socioeconomic profiling. The police pull over the car because, you know, it has those multiple equipment violations that anybody can see. It has those multiple equipment violations because it's a 30-year-old car that's the only thing that the driver, owner, occupant could afford. And the police say it's a cheap stop. Who knows? Maybe I'll find something in there, you know. And if I don't, I'll just let him go, like the two deputies did with, you know, Brian, attorney. I always said, you know, I read many police reports that made me think like, this is a really chicken shit stop. But then I thought, what about the ones I never see a report on, you know? And I know there are dozens of them, hundreds of them. And across the nation, millions of them. Millions of people experiencing harassment, perhaps, you know, I'm sure there are instances of racial harassment. I got stopped once driving my first car, a '68 black Cadillac, through Bloomington in the middle of the night for no other reason than I was driving a '68 black Cadillac through Bloomington.
You could.
Right. You know, and so I know that happens, but a lot of times it's just, you know, tens of thousands of petty indignities inflicted on people just because people of a certain socioeconomic or racial status are perceived as a higher risk for crime. And of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
You know.
In the other class I'm teaching on anti-racism, they made a couple of interesting points this week about crime. And he said very clearly, it's not because I want to excuse this away. I'm not trying to do that. But he said something along the lines of robbery and burglary in our country cost something like $18 billion worth of cost, right? That's the cost of that. White collar crime, white neighborhood crime, right, is 400 billion. And yet it's easier to catch the kid who's stolen a couple $1,000s worth of than to catch the investor who's done $100 million. Also said at one point, we call black neighborhoods dangerous because of these criminals, but we don't call white neighborhoods where the school shooting perpetrators typically come from. We don't call those dangerous. Why not? Much of that, like you said, is social economic. It's much simpler to blame the poor guy than the rich guy, because the poor guy's not going to fight back. The poor guy's neighborhood isn't going to fight back as easily. I guess the question about that is, how do we reverse all that? how do we turn it into something easier? Catherine?
Yeah, I think that it's a multi-faceted, and it's like the tentacles of an octopus. It's not any one thing that you can grasp. It's many different things, top to bottom, that need to be looked at. And that's why I think first of all, there needs to be reform in our policing and the kind of people that get drawn into being policemen and sheriffs and people like that. And also the people that get drawn into the working in the penal system. My ex-husband was in the military, and then he ended up working at Florence for a time. And I always thought it was, he stopped it, but I always thought it just was not a good idea because of his own personality and because of certain traits that he had. I didn't think it was a wise thing. So I think that what I mean by that is I believe that you need to be profiled as, if you're going to work in those kind of fields, you need to be screened psychologically. What kind of person are you, and what kind of tendencies do you have?
Yeah.
And I think it has to be looked at in a very clear-cut way, because people are drawn into certain things because of the very things that they can unfortunately get away with. And one of my children was working at a time in his life, and he had issues, my children all did, with their father because their father was abusive. And my son had some healthy ways that he acted it out, but he was a bouncer because he's a big guy. And he could remove you if you needed removing if you were misbehaving, and that was his job. But he could literally take you and bodily remove you from the scene if need be. And I did have some talks with him, and he doesn't do that anymore and hasn't for some long time, because I wanted him to understand what was behind that for him. And I think he got it. I think he understood it and understood himself and channeled his emotions, and he's done some good work on himself subsequently in other realms, and he works out a lot. So he was able to understand might doesn't necessarily make right. And I think we've got to just look at it in a whole different way, with a different lens and some different parameters and understandings.
The hard part is that in that system, the policing system, there is a lot of strength of body, might makes right type of that's easily brought into it. If a person comes in with cruelty as part of their personality, it easily can be augmented in that system if we're not careful. But I don't think we do a really good job of expecting extensive training of those police officers in all the different ways. We train them in techniques, but I'm not sure we're training them well in personality ways of doing those techniques.
Well, I think that's true, because if I don't want to deviate from our topic, but I think about people who are mentally ill and are mocked, people who are mentally disabled. There's so many ways where people are misunderstood, or where people have dementia, or they have other problems, addiction, etc. We expect a lot of our teachers. We expect too much of the policing system. they can't be all things to all people. It's knowing who to deal with what, how to deal with it, how to assess a situation. So it really kind of boils down to what is it we're dealing with and what systems are in place to get people hooked into the right aspect of the system to
Well,
really help them.
Yeah, and I think that part of that was borne out in the story about Ralph Myers. He was the other guy
Hmm.
played by
The white guy.
yeah,
Yeah.
where they forced him to miss witness what was going
Yeah.
on because of the fear that they placed on him. I don't think that always happens, but I think it's easy to say, let's take the simple solution rather than the harder solution. I think our system should be about, I'd rather let 10 people that are innocent go than unfairly jail somebody who is innocent.
Mhm.
But I'm not certain that's I'm not certain that's a good mentality for a prosecutor. I'm not certain it's a good mentality for a police officer, right? But it feels like part of our value should be on making sure that innocent doesn't get jailed rather than that guilty goes free. Did I say that fairly?
I am no advocate for the criminal justice system as a means to address antisocial behavior whatsoever. I think that to affect meaningful change, our entire focus has to be proactive, producing good citizens in the first place, rather than trying to correct. It's so ironic that, well, here in Minnesota anyway, the penal system is under the Department of Corrections. Well, to my way of thinking, very few people are corrected by the Department of Corrections.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them, because I think by the time most people have in their first serious encounter with the criminal justice system, I'm not talking about a speeding ticket or something like that, there's already been a major failure of socialization. And socialization is affected by the family and by the educational system. And that's where our focus has to be. And it's not rocket science.
Right.
Everybody that's on this screen right now knows what it takes to make a good person.
Yeah.
You got to have emotional support from people who care about you, people who are going to have expectations. There are going to be rewards, there are going to be consequences, there's going to be good role modeling. That's how you build a good person. It's not by building a better prison.
Yeah.
It just won't work, doesn't work.
Yeah. And yet pretty consistently across our nation, neighborhoods that breed crime, those types of neighborhoods are underfunded in a lot of different ways. Their schools get typically less money. There's less, the roads are more needing repair. The infrastructure in those neighborhoods is underwhelming. And that's pretty consistent across our nation. Why is it that we underfund that way? And then are surprised by the fact that crime happens on a higher level.
I think it's very important to create a positive environment, a physical environment in which young people can grow up and experience the kind of inputs to their character building that I've talked about. But it's all going to be meaningless unless the adults in their life are invested in making them good people. You know, lots of money and fancy things is no guarantee you're going to grow up to be a good kid. You know, what we would call a marginal upbringing, you know, socioeconomically, is no guarantee you're going to be doomed to antisocial behavior. You know, it's going to make having the kind of accomplishments our society values very difficult, but you can grow up to be a decent person. You know, I'm not indifferent. Like I said, I want everybody to get the same start and get as far down the road as they can. But the one thing that I have seen, you know, as a consistent crippling event, crippling not only for the person to whom it happens, but also to the product of the person to whom it happens, is young women becoming pregnant, you know, at the age of 15, 16, things like that. It is, I mean, I can't cite you statistics, but it's almost a guaranteed ticket to a miserable life for that young person and for their child. And quite frequently for that child's child,
Yeah.
you know.
And-
And anything we can do to break down that dynamic
Right.
is a step in the right direction.
And so how do we get involved in things like that? That's the question. Are there systems we can put in place? Are there ways we can put an infrastructure in those places where teenage pregnancy happens at a higher rate in order to help change that dynamic?
When Cory Booker started talking about, you know, how the biggest difficulty Black people face compared to white people is that they have no inheritance. They don't have, you know, they struggle to improve their lot because there's never anything, you know, coming their way materially from the generation that precedes them. I think it's our society's obligation. I think it would be a great investment. I've said this a million times before. My poor sister-in-law is probably sitting there not here. But I mean, I would say to every young, you know, person in those economically deprived areas, you know, Black, white, male, female, you know, every year from the time you are 14 on until the time you are 25, that you don't either father a child or bear a child, there's going to be $5,000 waiting for you when you hit that 25th birthday, you know. And it can be, you can have, you know, $50,000 waiting for you to make your life better.
Yeah.
When you're 25. And we will save money as a society if we do that. You know, people will say it'll never happen. People will say they're just holding us hostage with their bodies, you know, extorting ransom from us, you know, to prevent them from engaging in irresponsible behavior. I just say, you know, let's lay aside the moral indignation here because it's not helping, you know.
Right.
But I'm not saying it'll work. I don't know. But we got to try something because what we're doing right now isn't working.
What I hear you saying is, how do we make it so that the right path, the more society building path, becomes that which makes it easier for someone to take. Because I think about like the ghetto, right? If I want a kid to escape into a best life, right? How do I make it so that the easy path of becoming a drug dealer isn't the path that they take? Because that gets them out of the poverty side of things, but at what price to the rest of us? You know, how do I help that kid to, the movie that we watched a couple weeks ago, the kid who was killed was selling drugs because he had to raise his family. How do we help that kid? What infrastructure do we put in place? Can it be that $5,000 that is waiting there for him? You know, somehow we've got to answer that other question. Catherine, you look like you've got something to say.
Mhm. Well, I keep thinking about the word and what we have got to have is this, everybody has to have a sense of hope. And I think it really, that's at the core of it all. And I think it is a systemic problem. I think the challenges are tremendous, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying and trying different new ways. But it really has to do with our heart. It has to do with, I was very moved by this whole movie, and I don't happen to believe in capital punishment. I think I probably did at one point in my life, but I don't anymore. And I don't like the concept of incarceration. People have to be able to work their way out of whatever they've gotten themselves into. Another son of mine, 2 out of 3 have had problems, but and he was imprisoned for serious DUIs years ago, back about 2002. But the neat thing was, it was a medium security, and there were people that, you know, they were drugs being thrown over the wall, and there was this, that, and the other going on. My son John took classes, and he worked his way into being like a trustee, where he could actually go to get off of there, and he went and worked in the community, and he did things that made him feel better about himself. He made a very nominal sum, but he got away from the prison part of the time to work in the community and do good stuff with his body and his mind. And he did vow, and he didn't get involved in using pot and drugs and stuff like some of the people did, and accepting contraband and all that. And when he got out, I went and picked him up, and the people in this community took us to breakfast. They gave John a card and some money, and believed in him. And John made a vow that he would never go back. So I think that there are programs, and there are ways people can be rehabilitated from bad situations, and something good can come out of it. But we've got to start. I think, Randy, what you said is certainly true. We need to try different ways that work and that might work, rather than going down the road that is a road of failure.
It's really easy to take simple solutions rather than work for the harder. That's why we do punishment. You know, like if a kid's doing something wrong, swinging your hand and hitting his butt is a simple solution, but does it really deal with the problem? I get that, you know, sending them off in a corner so that you have a time to calm down helps, but if you don't go back there and then deal with the issue afterwards, then sending them in a corner didn't really solve anything.
Yeah, what's the real need? What is the real need? Yeah.
That's right. And it's the same type of thing when we're doing what needs to be punished, but are we truly filling the need? Taking care of the issue that caused it rather than just stopping a behavior. The hard part is that the whole criminal justice system is enormous in America. And the investments that have been made in things like private prisons is huge. The town where I went to high school is called Beeville, Texas. And when I was there, one of the big drivers of Beeville, Texas was Chase Field. It was a Naval Air Station, which has since been closed and taken over as a private prison. Guess what Beeville needs? They need the income from that private prison.
Yeah.
So to just close the private prison, which I'm personally against, also causes other issues in that community. What happens to the economy of Beeville, Texas, if I just close that facility? And so all of those issues have to be resolved as we move towards the next phase of whatever it is we think needs to happen. I wish I could give you easy answers around this. It's just too complex. But at least in this case, we see Mr. Stevenson saying, I am going to fight. I'm going to, in a very real way, set aside what I could be. You know, I could be a lawyer that makes this kind of money, but I'm going to be in this place and take care of an issue. And so one by one, I think it's at 140 people, he's helped to prove their innocence.
Well, I think to see if we can end on a note of hope, I saw this news piece, and perhaps you all have seen it too, about the race car driver who made the racial slur and who was then banned from driving. And now he has gone through some rehabilitation and was sent to anger management and sent to some other kind of sensitivity training, et cetera, and who really is owning his own behavior and who looks forward to hopefully being reinstated to be a race car driver, but who has been very public about, I was wrong and it was wrong of me to say the things that I said. And he talked to James Brown, and it was on CBS, and I like stories like that where people can turn their behavior around and their actions around in a very public way, and who want to make amends and who want to be a better human being. And I think the challenge for all of us is that where do we stand? Where does the church stand? Where do we stand in the church to be agents of change in the world?
Yeah, and I guess part of it is do we continue to perpetuate the easy answer for ourselves, or do we envision that which could be the best of us? And that takes work, envisioning that best of, right? We have to go back to change some very long held spaces in America, and expose them for not being perfect answers. Maybe they were right back whenever they were instituted. And it's not a question of that. It's how do we move towards the future that needs to be. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for watching this movie. Next week's movie is leading towards Halloween. It's A Ghost Story. Have you heard of it?
No.
All right.
I hope it's a little lighter.
It's a very interesting story about essentially a ghost that is still present in a house. Not so much as a haunting as that the ghost, is trying to find himself. He's still there because of the unresolved issues of him. All right. Stars Casey Affleck, but this is who you see Casey as. The ghost is just a person with a sheet over his head the whole time. Okay. So find that movie if you need to. You can come borrow the one that's here in the office. I'd love to have you have you see it and watch it. It's a good movie for us. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good week.
All right, you too.
Y'all have
Bye.
a good week. Take care.
See how do I get out of here?